Okay, well, there we go. Hopefully you can see that on your screens. We're in a series on the life of David, and for those of you who are watching online at home on the YouTube, our capture card isn't working, so the PowerPoint's not working up over here. But for those of you at home, hopefully you'll get to see the PowerPoint. We're very thankful for your presence again here today, and for those of you who are watching online as well. Last week we had a look at Psalm 23, and today we're back into the historical narrative, and next week we'll be back into the Psalms again. Next week we'll actually look at Psalm 59. And so maybe I would encourage you during this week to read that, and I'll remind you of that a little bit later. So last week we ended off with the anointing of David to be the king over the people of Israel, and that was in chapter 16. We're going to see the end of chapter 16 today, and then also 17, 18, and 19. And these chapters go very, very quickly. The writer of 1 Samuel crunches a lot of information into a very short period of time, or very few chapters, when in reality it probably took about 2 to 3 years. But it appears to be happening very quickly. And I just want you to keep that in mind as we read through this text and as we work through these chapters this morning. It's actually a chunk of time, 2 to 3 years, not just all happening on the spot today. Today we come to another section in the life of David that I'm sure many of us are quite familiar with, as we learn that David was not just a shepherd boy looking after sheep, but also he was very much an accomplished musician. And like I say, between now and next week, I'd like you to read Psalm 59. Now, one of the things we did last week as we introduced the life of David and these Psalms is we're looking at the historical narrative, and that's what we're looking at today. And then next week we'll actually look at the Psalm. And I think if you understand this historical narrative, then the Psalm means so much more when you understand exactly the background to that. And we'll see that in chapter 19 this morning as we get into some of that. So just note that down, write down Psalm 59. Again, I'll keep reminding you of this. David wasn't just out there looking after sheep as the sheep were grazing. He was also learning how to play the lyre. The lyre is something, probably sounds a little bit like a guitar today. It wasn't so much a harp, but more this lyre. And so he was learning to play this. He was learning to glorify God and sing songs of praise to God. And he writes so many of these psalms as well. But while he was learning these psalms, this is how it becomes known that he was a follower, or how he got to be in King Saul's courts, by the fact that he was such an accomplished songwriter and also musician. He's probably about 16 or 17 years old at this time when we see David as he gets to be invited into Saul's court. Now, we finished off last time in chapter 16 where, again, we said that David was being anointed as king. But there's a verse that I want you to keep in mind today. And this is a verse over here in James chapter 4 and verse 6. Because this will kind of encompass our lesson today. The verse says, God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. Some of your versions might have, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And so over here in 1 Samuel, God is going to be putting Saul down because of and God is opposing Saul because he was arrogant, because he was disobedient, he wasn't willing to obey God. And yet in these chapters, God is going to be lifting up David, this young shepherd boy. Now, like I said, we finished last week with David being anointed by Samuel. And so we look at our text there where it says, so Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. But notice this underlined bit that I put here. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. And this is what we see over here. This is a key to understanding these next few chapters, chapters 17, 18, and 19 here, is that we see God's Spirit coming powerfully on David. God is lifting up David. However, when you look at the very next verse, this is 1 Samuel chapter 16 and verse 14, it says, "Now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him." Some of our versions have got some different words here. An evil spirit, a harmful spirit, a tormenting spirit. One version just said a black mood, or a distressing spirit from the Lord had come upon him and was tormenting him. Now, we don't really know a lot about what this is. We don't know what type of spirit it is. If this was a good spirit that was tormenting him. We don't know if this is Satan using one of his spirits, or the spirit of Satan tormenting him, or using an evil spirit to torment him. We don't know if maybe Saul has returned back to his old self. And, as he's gotten older, he's just become darker as he's got older. We really don't know. But I want you to notice the contrast that is happening over here, that's being contrasted here. We have David, who has the Spirit of God in him. And on the other hand, we have Saul, who doesn't have the Spirit of God anymore, but rather this tormenting spirit, these black moods that comes on Saul. Now, because of this tormenting spirit, Saul goes into some really dark times. And you can see these men probably sitting around, they're thinking, hey, what can we do? How can we help Saul? He's going through all these black moods, these really dark places. What if we got someone who could play some music for him? And hopefully that music would soothe his spirits, and help him while he's in these dark times. I'm sure there was one of the guys over there said, hey, you know what? There's a guy down over there in Bethlehem by the name of David. And boy, this guy can play the lyre. Let's bring him in here, and so that he can play for King Saul and soothe his moods. And that's exactly what happens. They go and they find David, and they bring David into the courts of Saul. Now, music is very powerful. It's extremely powerful. Think about it. Think about this. Movies would not be movies without the music behind them. The music is really what makes the movie. A few years ago, Ricky took me to the Sydney Opera House, and we went and watched a James Bond movie. And they had this massive big screen in the Opera House, but they had this live orchestra, and there was the conductor conducting the music as this live orchestra was playing, and you could see the actual movie. It's the most amazing thing I've ever experienced in my life. And some of the time I was watching the movie and seeing all the action, but at the same time I was watching this orchestra and seeing the conductor as he's conducting, and it was so powerful. And you could almost feel the volume of the air being blown and moved across the room. It was an amazing experience. And that's what music does. Music has an ability to move us. Some of us have been watching the Paralympics, and you hear that national anthem being played, and our hearts just filled with pride, and it just touches us and moves us. Well, back then, this 3,000 years ago, they knew this exact same thing. And so David is enlisted to come to Gibeah to be over there with Saul. Now, Gibeah was the capital at the moment. David was down in Bethlehem. And then just a little bit above Bethlehem, you had Jerusalem. Back then was still called Jebus. It was occupied by the Jebusites. And then just a little bit north of that was this place called Gibeah, which was the capital at the time, because that's where Saul had made his headquarters, about 10 miles away from Bethlehem. And so we have David making these trips backwards and forwards from Bethlehem, where he's looking after the sheep, to going over there to be with Saul when this dark, tormenting spirit is on him, and he goes and plays the lyre there to soothe Saul. Now, one of the things you need to understand as we go through this text is here, Saul doesn't really know who David is at the time. Yes, David comes in there and he plays the lyre, but Saul didn't really fully comprehend, who David is. And you kind of think about this, anyone who's ever experienced a migraine, you don't really take much note of who's around. You're just in so much pain, your head just throbbing, it's miserable. And so here's David, and he comes into Saul's court, and he's going to be playing the lyre for him. But notice what it says here in verse 21 as David's playing the lyre. It says, now, David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul liked him very much, and David became one of his armor bearers. I don't think that Saul had a big idea of who David was. But David enters his court and becomes an armor bearer. This is quite an interesting thing as to who these armor bearers were and what they did. I think we need to understand a little bit about armor bearers. These were just people who got recruited into the army. It was kind of like doing an apprenticeship over there in the army. And sometimes these generals or kings or leaders would have a whole bunch of armor bearers. In fact, as you read on further in the text, Joab on one occasion has 10 armor bearers. And these guys would be the ones who would sharpen their swords, they'd carry their swords, carry their equipment, carry their shields, and they would basically just be assistants for the king or the general or whoever's the leader of the army. And so David is brought in over here into the palace. He's got an invitation to become one of Saul's armor bearers, to become one of his assistants. But all the time, he's kind of going backwards and forwards. He's heading back down to Bethlehem, about 10 miles away. And then he's brought back into the palace, and he goes and works over there for Saul, playing the lyre for him. And this is how chapter 16 ends. Then in chapter 17, we have probably one of the most familiar texts to a lot of us this morning. It's the story of David and Goliath. And it's an event that many of us heard, and we've learned this one. We were in Bible school, in Sunday school as kids, and hopefully if you don't know the story, I encourage you to go and read the whole chapter. We're not going to touch on the whole chapter here because we want to move into chapter 18 and 19. But we remember what happens here. David was down over there looking after the sheep. His brothers were actually in Saul's army. And so his dad said to him, I want you to go over there and take some supplies to your brothers, but also check and see how things are going. At this stage, Saul and his army were fighting against the Philistines. And as you read through the text, you'll find out that they come to this valley of Elah. The Philistines have lined up on one side. The Israelites have lined up on the other side. But instead of them all just engaging in the battle and going and killing each other, what happens is this man by the name of Goliath comes out there, and he taunts the Israelites. And he basically says to them, I tell you what, you send someone to come and fight against me. If I win and I kill him, hey, then you'll be our slaves. But if he wins and kills me, then we'll become your servants, and we will serve you. And so he's taunting the Israelites. I think he does this for more than a month. Well, David gets down there to visit his brothers and see what's happening. And just as he's there, Goliath comes out. And so David starts asking some questions. Hey, what's happening over here? What's this all about? And what are all these big boasts that Goliath is making? Look what the text says. He asked some of the guys some questions. And they said, the king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will give him his daughter in marriage, and he will exempt his family from taxes. And when you look at that reward, you go, wow, this is amazing. That's fantastic. Only problem is when you look at Goliath, you go, no ways. Because this guy is 9 feet tall. I mean, he's got full of armor. He's a trained soldier. And you think, no ways, there's no ways I'm going to go and fight him. Well, we know the events. David eventually goes out and fights him. One of the things we understand about David is not only was he a shepherd, not only was he this accomplished singer, but he really knew how to use a sling. A sling was this, as you can see on this picture here, it's just 2 long pieces of leather with a little pouch. And you could put a stone or a small rock in there, and swing it around. And then you can see one part probably looked around your hand, let the other side go, and you could shoot a stone very, very fast and very, very, very far. And these shepherds became quite accurate with these. Now, I just want you to try and imagine what happens here, because we know that stone flies through the air, hits Goliath in the head, and he falls down. I got a lovely picture here. I found this one. Can you imagine this guy 9 feet tall coming against you? But you're slinging that stone and would fly through the air pretty quick. Can you imagine being hit in the head with a cricket ball? I looked at some footage on YouTube about Brett Lee. And Brett Lee could bowl a cricket ball at 160 kilometers an hour. 160. They clocked him once at 161 kilometers an hour. You get hit on the head at 160 kilometers an hour and it's going to hurt. And that's why these guys have these helmets with these things. Goliath didn't have one of these cricket helmets on, and so he got hit on the head, and the stone, the Bible says the stone sunk into his head and he fell down. David didn't have a sword on him, so he went and took Goliath's sword and killed him. And David goes on from there and he becomes an instant celebrity. Straight away, this young man it becomes well known all over. And even King Saul thinks, who is this young man? I don't even know who he is. But he's told, hey, he's David. He's Jesse's son down over there in Bethlehem. And so with this sling and a stone, David kills Goliath. Very interesting. Chapter 18 and verse 1, chapter 18 starts off and says, after David had finished talking to Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David and loved him as himself. And as you read through the rest of 1 Samuel, you see this beautiful friendship, this wonderful relationship between these two men, and how David, how they love each other and how they care for each other. And so once after this, Saul decided to take David in and puts him in the army, and puts a whole bunch of men under him and sends him out on missions to fight against the Philistines. Now I want you to think about this. By this time, David is about 17 or 18 years of age, 17 or 18 years old, and he's going out on missions and fighting against the Philistines. And look at what it says here in verse 5. Whatever mission Saul sent him on, David was so successful that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. And this pleased all the troops and Saul's officers as well. I remember when I was in the army, I was a corporal in charge of 10 men, and that's when I was 18. I think of David here, about 17, 18 years old, given this high rank, over many, many soldiers. In one stage we'll see this, 1,000 men were put under him. So he becomes very successful as a military leader. But then something happens, and you see this over here in chapter 18 and verse 6 and 7. One day as they were coming back, and obviously after a lot of these battles that Saul and David have been fighting, the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine. And the women came out of the towns and to meet Saul, and they were singing and they were dancing and there was joyful songs and they were playing with the timbrels and the lyres. And as they danced, they sang the song, Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. And when Saul hears this, man, he just becomes so angry. And this anger starts burning inside of him. I want you to notice that the next text says, Saul was very angry. This refrain displeased him greatly. They have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. But I want you to notice that last line over there in 1 Samuel 18 and verse 8. Look at what Saul's thinking here. And this is just this 18-year-old kid. He says, what more can he get but the kingdom? And you think of Saul at the moment, he's in his mid-50s or so. And yes, David, this young kid, but he's thinking, hey, you know what more can he get but the kingdom. They've credited him with this killing of tens of thousands. And notice there in verse 9 it says, and so from that day on, Saul kept a close eye on David. And this is what we call, this is the rise of what we call the green-eyed monster. Because there's this jealousy raises its ugly head. And I'm sure that we've all experienced it. Maybe you've been a recipient of that, or maybe you've been the one who's been jealous of others. We've experienced it in the office. You may have experienced this jealousy in your family. Sometimes we experience it in the church. But I want us to watch for the rest of this lesson here what takes place with Saul. So in chapter 18, and we see a whole bunch of stories. And again, these are crunched very closely together. It seems like they're happening just one after the other. Again, it's taking probably 2 to 3 years for these things to take place. But the writer crunches a whole bunch of these things together. And what I want us to have a look at is some of these traits of jealousy. For those of you at home, you can't see our picture here, but I will give you about 6 or 7 different traits of jealousy. And the first one that we see here is rage. It's the first thing that happens. These girls are all singing the number one hit in Gibeah at the time. They're singing, Saul has killed his thousands, David has killed his tens of thousands. And all at once, this jealousy starts burning and starts eating away at Saul, and it blows up in rage. Look at the next verse there. It says in verse 10 and 11, the next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully on Saul. He was prophesying in the house, and while David was there and playing the lyre, as he usually did, Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying to himself, I'll pin David to the wall. But David eluded him twice. There's this rage, this anger that he has. He just wants to kill David. I'm quite intrigued about that last line there. David eluded him twice. I think for me, if it was after the first time he threw a spear at me, I thought, I'm out of here. I'm not going to stay here anymore. I want to go. But probably David's thinking, I'm young, I'm fit. So long as I see the spears coming, I can get out of the way. And he eluded this. But you can see this jealousy that is building up into this rage within Saul. A second trait of jealousy is distance. And this is what Saul does. He tries to distance David from himself. Look at and sends him far away. Look at our next verse, verse 12 and 13 of chapter 18. Saul was afraid of David. I think about this again. He's the king. King Saul is in his 50s. David's this young 18-year-old kid, but Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David but had departed from Saul. Again, you can see that contrast. So he sent David away from him and gave him command over 1,000 men. And David led their troops in their campaigns. Again, think about that as a young guy, 18, 19 years old, have 1,000 men under you. He's such a great leader here. But Saul realizes then, even though he sends him away, you know what, this doesn't work either. And so another one of these traits of jealousy, he starts scheming. Starts planning. He starts scheming and thinking of, hey, what can I do? Saul starts figuring out, what can I do to bring this guy down? What can I do to try and kill him, to try and get rid of him? And so you see his scheme over there in verse 17. It says, so David said to Saul, Saul said to David, here is my daughter Merab. I will give her to you in marriage. Only serve me bravely and fight the battles of the Lord. Saul said to him, I will not raise a hand, Saul said to himself, I will not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines do that. Again, you can see the scheming that he's got going through here. I'll give him my daughter in marriage. I won't have to kill him. Let the Philistines do that. And so you can see him going deeper and deeper into sin as he's trying to figure out, how do I get rid of David? How do I deal with this? And so that leads us to the next point. where I just see this as a trait of jealousy. It's these broken promises. Because the wedding day comes, and instead of David getting Merab as his wife, you might be thinking, whew, I'm going to become the king's son-in-law. But look what happens. Look what happens in the text. So when the time came for Merab, Saul's daughter, to be given to David, she was given in marriage to Adriel of Meholah. Now, I don't know if you've ever experienced this. I don't know if you've ever been to a wedding, and maybe you're all over there in your church and you're waiting for the bride to come walking down the aisle, and someone makes an announcement. Sorry, guys, she's not here. She's gone to another venue and she's getting married to someone else. I think we've gone like, whoa, I don't think we've ever experienced that. Hey, this is what happens to David here. He's there, and this Saul's daughter is given to someone else. Now, a lot of these marriages were arranged marriages, and we have some even in our family here who have arranged marriages, and that's fine. David probably didn't marry want to marry Merab out of love. I'm sure that came later. But again, you can see this jealousy of Saul as he's scheming, as he's planning, and then even gives Merab away. Our next trait of jealousy is this one here. We just call this manipulation and lies. And Saul later on, he's still manipulating. He's still thinking, what can I do? How can I get rid of David? He's filled with this jealousy that's just eating away at him. And so our text tells us there, then Saul ordered his attendants to speak privately to David and say, hey, look, the king likes you. And his attendants love you. Now become the king's son-in-law. And I kind of think, isn't that funny? Yeah, right. Don't you realize that just a few weeks ago he tried to kill me with a spear? You think he really wants me to become the king's son-in-law? But in the next verse, in verse 23, it says, David said, do you think it is a small matter to become the king's son-in-law? I'm only a poor man and little known. I mean, David's from a big family. There's 8 brothers. His dad hasn't died yet. He hasn't got an inheritance. He doesn't have a lot of money. He's serving in King Saul's army. I mean, I don't know how much they got paid at all. So he doesn't have a lot of money. Hey, what can I do? How can I marry the king's daughter? I don't have a lot of money. And again, we see this trait of jealousy, and this leads to this next one, which is, I don't just call it even more scheming. And so you've got Saul scheming in point number 3 there, and number 6, he's just scheming again, thinking, what can I do? What can I do? How can I do this? And he has his next plan. His next plan is in verse 24 and 25. When the servants reported David's response to Saul, he told them to tell David this: the king is not expecting any money from you at all, but go and kill 100 Philistines and bring evidence of their vengeance on the king's behalf. Avenge the king on his enemies. And I like what's in brackets there. Saul expected David to be killed in action. So he said, hey, go and kill 100 Philistines. Bring me evidence that you've killed these 100. There's this scheming, this planning. Maybe he'll get killed in battle. Maybe he'll get killed by these Philistines. Well, David goes out. He not only kills 100 Philistines, he actually kills 200 Philistines. And he brings back the evidence of that. And so every time you have Saul over here thinking, man, I just can't win. Well, no, you can't. Not if you're driven by jealousy and disobedience. That's simply not going to work. And so then Saul gave him his daughter Michal in marriage. And when Saul realized, look at this, that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became even more afraid of him. And he remained his enemy until for the rest of his days. And you think about what's happening here. Yes, Saul, he's sitting here, he's thinking about this. Now his daughter Michal is married to David. His son Jonathan is his best friend, The army officers absolutely love him. I mean, man alive, everything's happening for David. And God is saying, yes, that's what happens when you are disobedient. That's what happens when you're arrogant. That's what happens when when it's all about you and not about God. And when you reject me, God is saying, I will reject you. And so that's exactly what happens here. Chapter 19 opens like this. Chapter 19 and verse 1 says, so Saul told Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David. And again, we look at this here, and Jonathan thinks about this, and he says, Dad, you can't go and kill David. He goes and he tells David, you know what, the king is out here, he wants to kill you, he's out to take your life. But Jonathan said, hold on, let me just go and talk to my dad and find out what's happening here. Why does he want to kill you? Maybe it's just one of those black moods that he's in again. So Jonathan went and he spoke to Saul. And as you read about this in chapter 19, those opening verses there, you see that he says, Dad, what wrong has he done to you? He served you well. We've greatly benefited when he went out and he fought against the Philistine. He killed him and he brought a great victory. The Lord won a great victory for Israel that day. And you saw it and you were glad. I mean, why would you do wrong and kill David? What's he done, for no reason? And you see over there in verse 6 that it says that Saul listened to Jonathan and took this oath. As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death. And I want you to notice this verse, because as you read through the rest of 1 Samuel, you'll see these promises that Saul makes. And they mean nothing, because he just has no regard for God's law. And this is our last point here about this traits of jealousy. Number 7 over there is no regard for God or his name. He makes these fickle promises which he doesn't ever intend on carrying out. And so finally he said, I've just got to take him out. I have got to kill David. And like it says there. And so he sent some of his men to kill him in the morning. Let's just come back over here. Chapter 19 is the basis for Psalm 59. Now, if you're like me, you probably go, Psalm 59, I don't have a clue about what that psalm's about. And until studying this and preparing for some of these things, if you ask me what Psalm 59 was about, I'd probably go, I don't know. I know Psalm 23, I know Psalm 19, I know Psalm 51, I don't know what Psalm 119 is about. What's Psalm 59 about? Well, I don't know. But I want to encourage you to go and read that psalm, because what these events over here in chapter 19 is the basis for Psalm 59. And again, we'll have a look at that next week. David's in a real predicament here. His wife, Michal, is King Saul's daughter. But she finds herself in a real predicament as well. Because, hey, David's my husband now, but Saul wants to kill David. And so Michal comes to David and she says, you know what, David, King Saul has got men, they're right outside here. And they want to take your life. They want to kill you. I mean, we need to get you out of here tonight. And so she lowers him from a rope out of the window, and David escapes. She takes an idol and she lays it in the bed, and she puts some goat hair around where the head is. And so the next morning, these soldiers go and want to kill David. Here's our text. But Michal said, his wife warned him, if you don't run for your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed. So she let him down through a window and he escaped. And here it says Michal took this idol and she put this goat's hair by his head. And when the soldiers showed up the next morning, she said, "Oh, David can't come. He's sick in bed." And they look in there and they see this idol, they see this goat hair, and they go back to Saul and they say, "You know what? We can't. David's sick in bed." And Saul says, "Bring him in his bed. I want him dead. I want to kill him." And that's where we'll stop for now, and we'll have a look at this next week. Next week we want to read the Psalm 59 as we see what takes place over here and how David now writes a song about this event where Saul wants to take his life. I want to close off with a passage. Jesus said, "The truth is, everyone who sins is a slave to sin." John 8 verse 34. And that is what we see over here in the story of David. David is getting closer and closer to God, and Saul is getting deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper in sin, and is becoming more and more and more enslaved to sin as the time goes on. Becoming a slave to sin until the day he dies. There's this jealousy, this scheming, this disobedience. He's working Satan's plan all the time, trying to get to David. And we're going to see this, and we'll see a lot more Psalms and things as we look at, again, as we carry on with the historical narrative in a couple of weeks' time, and we'll see what lengths Saul will go to try and take David out. But the lesson that we need to learn today for each one of us here is that the more we move closer to God, God will move closer to us. But if we move away from God, we withdraw ourselves from Him. And we get ourselves more in the grip of sin and get more and more entangled in sin. And it will never let you go. So what do we want to do? Humble ourselves before the Lord, and He will lift you up. Let's be humble. Look out for these traits of jealousy. It's a terrible thing. It can harm us. But watch out that you don't become a slave to sin. We can be so grateful that we have Jesus and that He came and He lived and He died and He was victorious over sin. He was victorious over death. And through His death, burial and resurrection, we can be saved. It's very hard for us to offer an invitation for anyone to be baptized into Christ when we're all on Zoom and in our current circumstances. But we can always still make plans. I want to encourage you, don't let sin enslave you. Come to Jesus, come to Him for salvation. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time this morning. I'll end.